When a group of criminals stormed into a high-end jewelry store, they thought they were executing another easy hit. They saw a store owner, a black man alone. Someone they could intimidate, push aside, and leave ruined like the others. But what they didn't see was the past he had left behind, the years of discipline and combat experience honed in the world's most dangerous battlefields. What began as a robbery would spiral into something far greater, a war against corruption, a takedown of a gang that had operated in the shadows for too long, and a reckoning that no one, not even the police on their payroll, could stop. They had chosen the wrong man to cross, and by the time they realized it, it was already too late. The streets outside were quiet, but Malcolm Blackwood had learned long ago that peace was just a pause between storms. Inside Blackwood Luxuries, the soft hum of jazz played over the speakers. The store was spotless. Rows of custom-tailored suits, designer watches gleaming under glass, handcrafted leather shoes lined up like soldiers on parade, everything in its place. Malcolm locked up the cash drawer, checking the time. 8:52 p.m., almost closing. Then the door chimed. 5 men stepped inside. They weren't customers. Malcolm knew it the second he saw them. The way they moved, loose but deliberate. The way their eyes swept the store, calculating. Predators testing the waters. One of them, a tall man in a black bomber jacket, let out a low whistle as he walked past a row of Rolexes. Clayton Mad Dog Rourke. Malcolm had seen his type before. The kind that didn't ask. They took. "Nice spot you got here," Rourke said, running a hand over a glass case. "Didn't expect to see a shop like this. Owned by someone like you." Malcolm didn't take the bait. He kept his stance relaxed, but his body was coiled, watching, waiting. "You need something?" His voice was calm, steady. Rourke grinned, glancing at his crew. "Yeah, we're looking to do some shopping." The others chuckled. One of them, a guy in a gray hoodie, picked up a tie from the display and looped it around his neck. Another leaned against a case of $5,000 or cufflinks, tapping on the glass like he was about to place an order. Malcolm didn't move. "I get it," Rourke continued, stepping closer. "City's tough. Everybody's got to eat, right? I bet a place like this pulls in good money." His meaning was clear. This wasn't a visit. It was a message. Malcolm exhaled slowly. He could shut this down right now. Tell them to leave. Make it clear he wasn't playing. But that wasn't how this worked. Men like Rourke didn't walk out just because you told them to. They had to be convinced. And Malcolm had always been good at convincing people. Malcolm didn't answer right away. He let the silence settle, filling the space between them like a slow-moving tide. He had seen enough men like Rourke to recognize the game being played. They weren't here to rob him. Not yet. This was about control, about testing his limits, seeing how much space they could take before he pushed back. Rourke smiled, slow and easy, as if he were greeting an old friend. "Ain't no need to look at me like that, man. We're just talking." One of his men, stocky with a shaved head and arms covered in ink, reached for a rack of silk ties and flicked through them carelessly. "Damn! These prices are crazy. $500 for a piece of fabric?" He pulled one loose, running it between his fingers, lips curling in amusement. Another one, dressed in a gray hoodie, wandered toward the display case of watches. He leaned in close, exhaling against the glass, as if trying to fog it up. "These gotta be, what, 10 grand each? Maybe more?" His voice was casual, but his body language wasn't. His hands were in his pockets, but he was too close to the case, too focused on what was inside. Malcolm remained still, his arms loose at his sides, his breathing even. This was pressure testing. It was something predators did before they pounced. Not just street thugs, but animals too. Wolves circling prey, gauging weakness. They weren't just looking to take something. They were looking to take everything. Rourke pulled a cigar from his pocket, rolling it absently between his fingers. "Thing is, we've been hearing about this place. Real nice, real exclusive. Bet you pull in some serious cash." His smile lingered, but there was something behind it now. A suggestion, a warning. Guess that's why places like this don't usually last too long. You know what I mean? Malcolm didn't break eye contact. Stores closed. Rourke let out a slow, exaggerated sigh. That so? The guy in the hoodie dragged his fingers across the watch case, slow and deliberate. The smudges left behind looked like shadows stretching beneath the display lights. Malcolm's stomach tightened. Not yet. The tattooed one nudged a suit rack, knocking a tailored blazer off its hanger and onto the floor. Damn, my bad, he muttered, grinning as he stepped over it like it wasn't even there. Malcolm didn't move. He could feel the air shifting. The laughter from the gang was looser now, sharper at the edges, the kind that carried no real humor, just an undercurrent of malice. Rourke tilted his head, looking Malcolm over like he was studying a museum piece. You ain't saying much, man. That's what I like about you. Got that whole strong and silent thing going on. His grin widened. But, see, you not saying nothing? That's a mistake. The moment stretched, and then Rourke flicked his cigar onto the floor. It landed near Malcolm's feet, rolling once before coming to a stop, smoke curling toward the ceiling. The signal was given. The tattooed man reached for a display stand and yanked it down with a crash. Gray hoodie knocked over a shelf, sending cologne bottles and accessories shattering across the tile. Another thug grabbed a handful of silk shirts and tossed them to the ground. Chaos spread like a fire. They weren't stealing. Not yet. They were taking something else first. His dignity, his fear, his compliance. Malcolm's hands flexed at his sides, knuckles rolling, every inch of him ready to move. Almost, but he didn't. Not yet. He felt Rourke's eyes on him, measuring, waiting for a crack in the calm. Malcolm had played this game before, just on different battlefields. The first one to break, to lash out, to lose control, lost. Rourke smiled, as if he had already won. See, that's the thing. You got this whole tough guy thing going on, but at the end of the day, he leaned in just slightly. You're just a shopkeeper. The guy in the hoodie moved a hand inside his pocket. Malcolm knew before it even happened. A flash of black metal. A Glock, drawn slow but deliberate, just high enough for Malcolm to see. Not aimed, not yet. Just shown. A statement. A challenge. Malcolm finally moved. Not much. Just a shift in weight, a slight tilt of his head. His eyes locked onto Rourke's, and then he smiled. Rourke's smirk faltered. Not by much, not enough for his men to notice. But Malcolm saw it. That was the second mistake. Malcolm's smile barely shifted. Just a flicker of amusement that never reached his eyes, but it was enough to make Rourke hesitate. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. Every time he and his crew had done this before, the response had been predictable. Fear, stammering, compliance. But the man standing in front of him, arms loose at his sides, weight balanced, didn't look afraid. He didn't even look concerned. And that was a problem. Gray hoodie had stopped near the display case, one hand resting against the glass, the other tucked into his pocket, fingers wrapped around something. He hadn't drawn it, wasn't waving it around to make a point, but Malcolm had already clocked it. A weight in his jacket, a shift in his stance, the casual way his fingers twitched. It was there. A presence as certain as the men tearing apart his store. Rourke sighed, shaking his head with mock disappointment. All right, man, let's not waste time. You already know how this goes. He waved a hand at the mess around them. The overturned racks, the scattered ties, the suit that had been knocked onto the floor. The small but deliberate chaos meant to remind Malcolm that he wasn't in control here. We take what we want. You stand there and keep your mouth shut, and nobody walks out of here upset. Sound fair? Malcolm tilted his head slightly. I don't recall making a deal. The answer made one of the crew chuckle under his breath. Rourke's smirk stayed in place, but Malcolm caught the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers tapped idly against his thigh. He didn't like being challenged. Rourke nodded slowly, as if considering his words. See, most folks know better than to argue. Some even help us out. Make sure we get the good stuff. Bag it up nice and easy. You want to know why? He leaned in slightly, voice quieter now, but heavier with intent. Because they know if they don't, things get difficult. And when things get difficult, people start getting hurt. He let the words settle, gave them weight. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. You don't look like someone who likes difficult things. The tattooed one let out a sharp laugh. Oh, he's got jokes. Rourke chuckled, but there was no real humor in it. He turned slightly, nodding toward Gray Hoodie. Check the back office. Grab whatever cash he's got in there. Gray Hoodie hesitated, just for a second. Maybe he wasn't sure why this job felt different. Maybe it was the way Malcolm hadn't flinched, hadn't backed down. But whatever was running through his head didn't last long. He nodded, slipping past the counter and disappearing into the hallway leading to the back rooms. Tattooed guy cracked his knuckles, rolling his shoulders like he was about to get to work. Let's speed this up. Two others unzipped their duffel bags and started stripping the store clean. Expensive suits ripped off racks, watches shoved into pockets, silk ties tossed like scraps onto the floor. One of them swiped his arm across a display shelf just to hear the sound of things breaking. Rourke watched for a moment, satisfied, then turned back to Malcolm, shaking his head like he was genuinely disappointed in him. See, this didn't have to be messy. I figured a man like you would understand how this works. Guess I was wrong. Malcolm's expression didn't change. A man like me? Rourke's smirk sharpened. Smart. Knows how to read a situation. Knows when to take a step back instead of making life harder for himself. He gestured lazily toward the back office. You think this is just about your store? You think we haven't been through a dozen places like this already? You're just another stop on the list, man. So, you can make this easy, or you can make it real damn miserable. Malcolm exhaled slowly, shifting his weight. And what happens if I don't make it easy? Tattooed guy grinned. You don't want to know? Rourke stepped forward again, his presence looming, his voice dropping to something quieter. Just for Malcolm, here's what's gonna happen. My guy in the back, he's gonna find your stash, whatever cash you got hidden away, and he's gonna bring it out here. My boys? He gestured around to the looting. They're gonna take what they like. And you're gonna stand right there and watch, 'cause the second you do anything stupid, well, he gave a slow shrug, nodding toward Gray Hoodie's hand resting casually inside his jacket. Malcolm let the silence stretch, studying the men in front of him. They thought they had him pegged. Another businessman trying to play tough. Another store to rip apart. Another easy night. But they had miscalculated. He could hear Gray Hoodie rummaging in the back office, drawers opening and closing, searching for a safe that didn't exist. The others were too busy filling their bags to notice how little he had moved, how carefully he had been watching. Rourke had stepped in just a little too close, overestimating the space he had in the room. They thought they had already won. Malcolm let out a slow breath, like he was resigning himself to what was happening. Rourke smirked, ready to claim the moment as a victory. That was his mistake. Malcolm stood motionless, his gaze trailing the movements of Rourke's men as they stripped his store like scavengers. Gray Hoodie was still in the back office, searching for a safe that didn't exist, while the others stuffed duffel bags full of watches, suits, and anything that looked valuable. He wasn't in a rush to make a move. Not yet. He needed them to believe he was still processing, still debating whether he would comply or resist. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head just a little, a motion that was calculated to look natural. I gotta ask, he said, his voice calm, steady. Why my place? Rourke, who had been watching the operation like a foreman overseeing his workers, turned back toward him with a smirk. Why? He repeated, amused by the question. Man, you think you special or something? Malcolm shrugged, giving a slight tilt of his head. Just seems like you all came in here with a plan. Real specific about how this was gonna go. That's not how smash and grabs work. You don't just pick a spot like this and know exactly where to go, what to grab, what to look for. He nodded toward the back office. And you sure as hell don't start checking for a safe unless someone told you there'd be one. Rourke's grin didn't fade, but Malcolm caught the tiny flicker of irritation in his eyes. He hadn't expected pushback. not in the form of logic. Most people, by this point, were too rattled, too desperate to keep things from escalating. But Malcolm wasn't playing along. "Man, listen to you," Rourke said, chuckling. "You a detective now?" Malcolm let the silence stretch, watching him carefully. The way Rourke had said it was supposed to be dismissive, a joke at Malcolm's expense. But there was an edge to it, a slight shift in his tone, as if Malcolm had pressed on something he wasn't supposed to. He glanced toward Tattooed Guy, who had been tossing expensive ties into a bag, but now seemed distracted, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Malcolm turned his gaze back to Rourke. "You've been through a dozen places like this already, right?" "That's what you said." He let the words settle, kept his voice even. "They all look like mine?" That did it. The humor in Rourke's expression faded just enough for Malcolm to see the truth. He hadn't just been randomly hit. This was targeted. Malcolm knew the pattern, even if he didn't have the full picture yet. The other black business owners in the neighborhood had been hit recently too. But when they called the cops, they had been met with the same indifference he had. No real investigations. No arrests. Just another statistic. Another loss written off. The problem was, he wasn't the type to just write things off. Rourke's smirk was back, but now Malcolm could see the irritation beneath it. "Don't know what you're getting at, man," he said, shaking his head. "You acting like we keeping some kind of list." Malcolm didn't answer, just exhaled again, his stance loosening slightly. An intentional tell. He wanted them to think he was slipping into compliance, the way they expected. He needed them to buy it. In the back office, Gray Hoodie was still rustling through drawers, cursing under his breath. He wasn't going to find what he was looking for. "Come on, man," Rourke sighed, sounding almost bored. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." He gestured toward the mess around them. "It's already happening. You can't stop it. So why waste energy trying?" Malcolm looked around the room, as if finally taking in the destruction. The shattered glass, the emptied shelves, the chaos they had brought into his space. Then he rolled his shoulders and adjusted his cuffs. Rourke squinted, picking up on the small shift, but he didn't react fast enough, because that was the moment Malcolm decided to fight back. And he never hesitated once a decision was made. Before Rourke could take a step back, before Tattooed Guy could reach into his jacket, before the others had a chance to register what was happening, Malcolm moved first. But he knew from experience that a single, well-executed attack wouldn't be enough to take down a group like this. He had spent years reading opponents, anticipating their reactions, understanding how violence played out when men thought they had the upper hand. The moment he struck, they would swarm. And if he wasn't smart, if he let them press him into a corner, even his training wouldn't be enough. So he fought like he always had. Fast, aggressive, and unpredictable. Tattooed Guy barely had time to react before Malcolm's hand clamped down on his wrist, twisting hard, forcing whatever he was reaching for back into his jacket. He barely got out a curse before Malcolm's elbow smashed into the bridge of his nose, the impact sending a sharp spray of blood onto the tile. The man let out a strangled noise and stumbled backward, but Malcolm didn't stick around to watch him recover. A shadow moved in his peripheral vision. Another one was already coming. Malcolm pivoted just in time to see Lanky Guy throwing a punch, fast but uncoordinated, too wild to be effective. Malcolm didn't dodge outright. He had learned long ago that dodging wasted movement. Instead, he stepped just enough to the side to take the sting out of the impact, absorbing the punch against his shoulder rather than his face. The hit barely slowed him down. Lanky Guy, however, had overcommitted, his weight thrown too far forward. Malcolm saw the opening and took it instantly, his knee driving into the soft part of the man's stomach with a brutal precision that sent him reeling. He wheezed, doubling over. But Malcolm didn't let him get his footing back. With a sharp movement, he grabbed the man by the collar and yanked him forward, sending him crashing into a display shelf. But there was no time to capitalize on the damage. The others had caught up. A sudden, crushing impact to his ribs made Malcolm grunt, the pain sharp, immediate. He twisted with it, keeping his feet, but before he could reset his stance, another fist slammed into the side of his jaw. This one was solid, well placed. His vision blurred for a half-second, enough for another pair of hands to grab him from behind. They were getting smarter, adjusting. The grip around his arms tightened. Someone was trying to lock him down, stop him from moving. Malcolm acted on instinct, bending his knees and driving his head backward with full force. The impact was sudden and brutal. He felt his skull connect with the man's face, heard the sickening crunch of bone. The grip loosened just enough. Malcolm twisted, breaking free. But as he turned, a metal display rod swung toward his ribs, aimed to take him down. He barely managed to block with his forearm, but the impact still sent a deep ache through his muscles. It wouldn't break anything, but he couldn't afford to take many more of those. Rourke was still watching, still waiting. He hadn't joined the fight. Not yet. He was smart enough to know that his guys weren't done, that Malcolm was still outnumbered. The gang had started in a place of confidence, believing this would be easy. But now there was a shift. Malcolm could see it in the way they hesitated before throwing their next punch, in the way they started positioning themselves differently, moving less like a group of thugs and more like cornered animals realizing they might have underestimated the fight. But they weren't done yet, and neither was Malcolm. Gray Hoodie had just come sprinting back from the office, his expression shifting from confusion to anger as he took in the mess unfolding in the store. Without thinking, he lunged straight at Malcolm, throwing a blind punch with everything he had. Malcolm ducked low, felt the wind of the mist swing pass just over his head, then came up fast, driving a palm strike into Gray Hoodie's sternum. It wasn't a knockout hit, but it knocked the air out of him, sent him stumbling back a step, gasping. And that was when Rourke finally moved. Unlike his men, his attack wasn't rushed or careless. He stepped in quickly, smoothly. And before Malcolm could fully turn, he felt a hard, precise strike land against his ribs, aimed exactly where the last hit had weakened him. The pain flared again, sharper now, and he had to grit his teeth to keep from making a sound. Rourke didn't let up. Malcolm caught the next punch, but the one after that connected with his jaw, rattling his vision again. He had to move, had to create space. He twisted away, shifting to the side, forcing Rourke's men between them before the gang leader could press his advantage. The rest of them were still moving, still trying to regroup, and Malcolm had to make sure this didn't turn into a dog pile. That was when he saw it. Two of them, tattooed guy and lanky guy, still recovering but not out of the fight, were grabbing what they could, stuffing watches and suits into their bags, not even bothering to check what they were taking. They were retreating. They hadn't come here expecting a war, and now that they realized this wasn't going to be an easy job, some of them were already shifting from fight mode to escape mode. Malcolm let them. He wasn't here to chase them down. He wasn't done yet. Rourke was still in front of him, still standing, still thinking he could win this fight. Malcolm exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as he took a step forward, ignoring the dull ache in his ribs. "Looks like your boys have other plans," Malcolm muttered, his voice even. Rourke barely spared a glance toward his men, even as they started moving toward the door, duffel bags stuffed with whatever they could grab. His focus was on Malcolm now, and for the first time, the casual arrogance was beginning to wear thin. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. Malcolm shifted his stance, rolling his shoulders as he tried to shake off the ache settling into his ribs. The sharp pain beneath his skin told him he had taken a few good shots. But pain was just another sensation, something to be acknowledged, and then pushed aside. Across from him, Rourke adjusted his footing, scanning the wreckage of the store, taking stock of his men. The gang was still standing, still fighting, but their confidence had cracked. This wasn't the easy job they had expected. The fight had turned into something else, something messy, something they weren't in control of anymore. Malcolm could see it in the way they hesitated, the way some of them weren't looking at him, but at the door. Behind Rourke, Two of his men were shoving whatever they could into their duffel bags. Their movements hurried now. They weren't retreating yet, but the priority had shifted. Get what you can and get out. The ones still throwing punches were only trying to buy time. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to leave. That was their mistake. Gray Hoodie moved first, lunging in from Malcolm's left, trying to blindside him, while another, a broad-shouldered man still shaking off the last hit he had taken, came in from the right. They were trying to box him in, cut off his angles, force him into a place where they could take him down fast. Malcolm didn't backpedal. He stepped into the attack instead, disrupting their timing before they could get comfortable. His elbow snapped up, catching Gray Hoodie hard across the jaw, sending him stumbling sideways into a rack of leather belts. The second attacker, who had been aiming a punch at Malcolm's ribs, managed to land his shot, but Malcolm turned into it, absorbing the impact in a way that let him roll with it instead of taking the full force. The second he felt the fist connect, he countered, catching the attacker's wrist and yanking him forward into a vicious knee to the stomach. The man wheezed as the air rushed from his lungs, his body folding inward. Malcolm followed up with a downward strike to the back of his head, sending him crumpling to the floor. Gray Hoodie had recovered enough to come at him again, his expression twisted with frustration. Malcolm saw his hand dip into his jacket and knew he was reaching for something. He didn't wait to find out what it was. He lunged, closing the distance between them in a single step, grabbing the front of his hoodie with both hands and driving him backward into a shelving unit. Bottles of cologne toppled to the ground, shattering at their feet. Malcolm pulled him forward again, then threw him down, hard, leaving him groaning on the floor. Across the store, the two men still grabbing merchandise had nearly filled their bags. Malcolm started toward them, but Rourke stepped into his path, cutting him off. He was still standing, still squared up, his fists still raised, but Malcolm could see the hesitation in his stance now. He had been in enough fights to know when someone was recalculating, trying to decide if this was worth it anymore. "You really think this changes anything?" Rourke asked, breathing hard. His lip was split. His stance wasn't as strong as before, but he still held himself like a man who refused to acknowledge he had lost. "You're just one guy. You can't stop this." Malcolm wiped a smear of blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Seems like I just did." Rourke let out a slow breath through his nose, his jaw flexing as he took in the rest of the scene. The store was trashed, broken glass covering the floor, shelves overturned, the sound of scattered merchandise still settling in the wreckage. Two of his men were still trying to make a break for it, their bags heavy with stolen goods. Malcolm saw the moment when Rourke made his decision, when he accepted that he wasn't going to win this fight, but that didn't mean they had to walk away empty-handed. "Forget it," Rourke snarled. "We got what we came for. Move!" Gray Hoodie was still groaning on the floor, but the others snapped to attention. The two who had been gathering jewelry slung their bags over their shoulders and sprinted for the door. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He reached out, grabbing the nearest one by the collar and yanking him backward just as he was about to clear the exit. The momentum sent the man sprawling onto the ground, his bags spilling open, watches and necklaces scattering across the floor. Malcolm barely had time to register it before another one of the gang swung a heavy fist at his ribs. The punch landed, sending a fresh jolt of pain through his side, but Malcolm gritted his teeth and turned with it, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it hard. The thug yelped as Malcolm used the momentum to send him crashing into the side of a display case, the glass cracking under the impact. The last remaining man with a full bag made it through the door, disappearing into the night. Rourke backed away toward the exit, his breath heavy, his hands still clenched into fists. But he wasn't moving to throw another punch. He was just making sure Malcolm didn't follow. "This ain't over," Rourke muttered. He took another slow step back, his pride making it difficult to retreat. But he did. He turned sharply and followed his crew out the door. Malcolm let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders, shaking off the tension in his muscles. The store was in ruins. Shelves overturned, shattered glass crunching under his boots, expensive suits and watches scattered across the floor. They had come here expecting an easy win, expecting fear, expecting compliance. Instead, they had left with broken noses, bruised ribs, and less than they came for. But Malcolm knew this wasn't over. And next time, he wasn't going to let a single one of them walk away. The scent of spilled cologne lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp metallic tang of blood and the acrid bite of adrenaline still coursing through Malcolm's veins. His store was a wreck, glass shards glittering like shattered ice beneath the overhead lights, shelves knocked over, expensive watches scattered across the floor. The fight was over, but the damage remained, a silent testament to what had just happened. His ribs ached with every breath, bruises forming beneath his skin, but he ignored the pain, focused instead on what had been taken. They had gotten away with some of the jewelry, running off into the night with duffel bags slung over their shoulders. He had put up a fight, had knocked some of them down hard enough to make them rethink ever stepping foot in his store again. But the fact remained, they had still walked away with something that belonged to him. And worse than that, they hadn't been afraid. They had moved with a confidence that stuck in his mind like a thorn. They hadn't rushed, hadn't worried about cops showing up. They had walked in here like they had the right, like they weren't worried about consequences. Because they weren't. Malcolm exhaled, forcing his breathing to steady as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He swiped to dial 911, pressing the device to his ear as he turned in a slow circle, surveying the destruction. The call rang 4 times before a dispatcher answered, her tone clipped and uninterested. 911. What's your emergency? My store was just robbed, Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the frustration simmering beneath the surface. A group of 5, maybe 6 men. They were armed. I fought them off, but they still got away with merchandise. I need officers dispatched now. There was a pause. Then, what's your location? 7th and Charleston. Malcolm's men's boutique. Another pause. Longer this time. He could hear the faint sound of keys clicking on the other end, the sound of a file being pulled up. Are the suspects still on scene? No. The dispatcher hesitated, as if deciding whether this was worth the trouble. So, you're reporting a robbery after the fact? Malcolm clenched his jaw. It happened less than 5 minutes ago. If you send a unit now, they might still be in the area. There was a beat of silence. Then, in a tone that was just a little too indifferent, the dispatcher replied, officers will be sent when available. When available? Malcolm repeated, the words sharp. An armed gang just ransacked my store. And you're telling me this isn't a priority? There are active emergencies across the city. The dispatcher said flatly, if you have security footage, officers will follow up with you for a report. Malcolm ran a hand over his face, exhaling through his nose. He could already hear it in her tone. This call wasn't going anywhere. How many other stores have reported robberies like this in the last month? He asked. A pause, then the sound of clicking stopped. That information isn't available to the public. Of course it wasn't. Malcolm didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, he asked, if I was calling from a store downtown, would this be getting a different response? Another pause. Then, curtly, an officer will be sent when available. Click. The line went dead. Malcolm stood there, staring at his phone, his grip tightening around the device before he forced himself to relax. The quiet of the store pressed in around him, the distant sounds of the city muffled by the broken windows and the hum of the overhead lights. He glanced toward the entrance, his eyes narrowing as he processed what had just happened. They weren't coming. Not yet, anyway. And when they did, they wouldn't be coming to help. He turned, stepping carefully over broken glass, as he made his way toward the back office. His ribs protested the movement, but he ignored the pain, moving with purpose as he reached for the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled it open. Inside, beneath stacks of invoices and supply orders, sat a small black notebook. His own records, his own observations. Malcolm wasn't the type to ignore details. He had noticed the pattern weeks ago, had heard the murmurs from other shop owners, but he had brushed it off as coincidence, as city crime being city crime. Now, standing in the ruins of his own store, He knew better. He flipped through the pages quickly, scanning the names. Businesses, dates, patterns, every single one of them black-owned. His fingers tightened around the edges of the notebook as realization sank in. They weren't just robbing for money. They were targeting people like him. And the police? They were turning a blind eye, letting it happen. Or worse, they were in on it. A sharp knock on the door made him look up. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, setting the notebook down before making his way to the entrance. He unlocked it, pulling it open to find two officers standing on the sidewalk. Their uniforms were neat, pressed, their expressions unreadable. The taller one, a middle-aged man with graying hair, tilted his head slightly as he looked past Malcolm, surveying the damage inside. He let out a slow, unimpressed breath before turning his gaze back toward him. "You the owner?" Malcolm stared at him for a long moment before nodding. The officer pulled out a small notepad, flipping it open with a flick of his wrist. "All right, let's get this over with." The phrasing made Malcolm's jaw tighten, but he didn't react. He stepped back, allowing them inside. The second officer, younger, barely out of his 20s, took in the scene with mild curiosity, his hands tucked into his belt. "So," the older cop continued, "what exactly do you think happened here?" Malcolm exhaled, keeping his voice level. "Like I said on the call, a gang came in, 5 or 6 men, armed, took merchandise, roughed the place up." The officer nodded, jotting something down lazily. "And you're saying this was a robbery?" Malcolm narrowed his eyes slightly. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The cop let out a slow breath, flipping his notepad closed. "Yeah, well, best thing you can do is file a report, contact your insurance. We'll look into it, but I wouldn't expect much." Malcolm stared at him. "They stole thousands of dollars in merchandise. You're telling me you're not even going to try to track them down?" The younger officer shifted slightly, his gaze darting toward his partner. But he didn't speak. The older one simply shrugged. "It's a big city, Mr. Carter. These things happen." Malcolm's fingers curled at his sides, his body coiled with barely restrained frustration. These things happen. They weren't going to do anything. They had never planned to, and the gang had known that before they even walked through his doors. Malcolm inhaled slowly, steadying himself. Fine. If no one else was going to stop this, then he would. The cops left without taking a single step beyond the entrance. They didn't ask for security footage, didn't take inventory of what was stolen, didn't even pretend they were going to look into it. They had lingered just long enough to act like their presence meant something, scrawled a few meaningless notes in their report book, then walked out with the same indifference they had come in with. Malcolm stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into their cruiser, watching the red and blue lights flicker once before vanishing into the night. The city swallowed them up just as easily as it had swallowed every other half-hearted attempt at justice in neighborhoods like his. They weren't coming back. They never were. He exhaled slowly, pushing the door shut and locking it behind him. The quiet inside the store felt heavier now, thick with the weight of realization. The cops didn't care. The gang knew they didn't care. And if Malcolm had been anyone else, if he had been some kid behind the counter instead of a man who knew how to fight back, he might have ended up on the floor like one of the broken display cases. This wasn't random. He knew that now. And he wasn't the only one it had happened to. Malcolm moved to the counter, grabbing his black notebook from the back office and flipping it open again. The list of businesses stared back at him, the pattern too clear now to be ignored. Each name belonged to a black business owner. Each one had reported a break-in, a robbery, or some kind of vandalism in the last 2 months. Some of them had been hit more than once, and the cops had done nothing about it. He ran a hand over his jaw, his mind working through the details, piecing together a puzzle he didn't have all the edges for yet. The gang wasn't just targeting high-end stores. They had hit mom-and-pop shops, convenience stores, barbershops, even a family-owned restaurant, places that weren't making millions, places where the stolen goods wouldn't even be worth that much on the street. So why? If this was just about money, why not hit bigger stores? Chain businesses? Places that could afford to take the loss? No. this wasn't just about cash. It was about who they were robbing. Malcolm set the notebook down, pressing his hands against the counter as he exhaled through his nose. If the police weren't going to do their jobs, then he needed to find out what was really happening on his own. And the first step was talking to the people who had already been hit. He grabbed his coat, slipping it over his sore shoulders before heading to the door. He needed answers, and there was only one place to start. The streets were quieter at this hour, the usual city noise dulled by the late-night lull. Malcolm walked with purpose, his breath visible in the cool air as he made his way toward his first stop, Curtis's barbershop. Curtis King had been running his shop for almost 20 years, and in all that time, Malcolm had never once heard about it being hit, until now. The lights inside were still on when Malcolm arrived. The closed sign flipped, but the door unlocked. He pushed it open, the bell above the entrance chiming softly as he stepped inside. Curtis was behind the counter, counting cash, his usual relaxed demeanor absent. He looked up as Malcolm entered, his brow furrowing. "Damn, man," Curtis said, his gaze dropping to the bruises forming along Malcolm's jaw. "You get into it with somebody?" Malcolm gave a small, humorless smirk. "Something like that." Curtis set down the money, leaning against the counter. "Heard about what happened at your place. You all right?" "I'll live," Malcolm said. He moved toward the counter, resting his hands on the edge. "That's why I'm here, actually. I need to ask you something." Curtis's expression darkened slightly, his posture shifting. "Let me guess. You're trying to figure out why we're all getting hit?" Malcolm nodded. "You too?" Curtis exhaled, shaking his head. 3 weeks ago. Came in the next morning, place was trashed. They didn't take much, just some clippers. A few things from the register. Could have been worse. Did you call the cops? Curtis let out a short, bitter laugh. Of course I did. You know what they told me? Probably some teenagers looking for quick cash. Nothing we can do, he scoffed. Didn't even take a statement. Just told me to beef up my security and let it go. Malcolm clenched his jaw, the confirmation settling deep in his chest. This isn't random, he said. Curtis sighed. No, it's not. Malcolm hesitated, then asked, You hear anything? Names? Anything that might tell us who's behind this? Curtis ran a hand over his head, his expression tense. Word on the street is that some of these guys work for someone higher up, not just some random crew. Somebody with money. Somebody with connections. Malcolm's stomach tightened. You know a name? Curtis hesitated. Then, finally, he said, Yeah, Rico Vargas. The name wasn't familiar to Malcolm, but the way Curtis said it, quiet, careful, like just speaking it out loud was a risk, told him everything he needed to know. You're sure? Malcolm pressed. Curtis nodded. Positive. This guy? He's been making moves in the city for a while now. I don't know what his endgame is, but I know he doesn't operate alone. He's got muscle. He's got people looking the other way for him. Malcolm leaned back, absorbing the information. Rico Vargas. A name to chase. A thread to pull. You planning to do something about this? Curtis asked, his tone knowing. Malcolm met his gaze, his voice even. Yeah, he said. I am. Curtis exhaled, shaking his head. Just be careful, man. You go after this the wrong way, and you're gonna end up with a bigger problem than a wrecked store. Malcolm offered a small nod, but he had already made up his mind. This wasn't over. Not even close. Malcolm walked out of Curtis's barbershop with his mind sharp and his steps measured, his thoughts running a tight, controlled circuit as he processed what he had just learned. Rico Vargas. A name he didn't know, but one that clearly carried weight. If this guy was behind the robberies, it meant he wasn't some low-level thug scraping by on petty crimes. He was orchestrating something bigger. The city stretched out before him, quiet in the late-night haze, streetlights buzzing faintly overhead. He didn't have a full plan yet, but he knew his next move. If he was going to dismantle the gang, he needed to know everything about them. Where they operated, who worked for them, what made them tick, and he knew exactly where to start. 20 minutes later, Malcolm was sitting in the back of Lucky's, a dive bar tucked between a rundown liquor store and an abandoned laundromat, the kind of place where cash was king And questions got you punched in the mouth. He had been here before, years ago, when he was still trying to reacclimate to civilian life, when he needed a place to sit in silence and let his mind settle. Now, it served a different purpose. The bartender barely looked up as he slid a whiskey in front of him, recognizing Malcolm, but smart enough not to ask why he was back. The real reason he was here was sitting 3 stools down, nursing a half-empty beer and tapping his fingers against the bar in a slow, rhythmic beat. Trey Knox. Malcolm had known Trey for a long time, ever since the man used to run with small-time crews back in the day. Trey wasn't a gangster, not really. He was an informant, a hustler, a man who made his living knowing things and selling that knowledge to people willing to pay. Malcolm picked up his drink, took a slow sip, then set it down with enough weight to make the glasses nearby rattle. Trey's fingers stopped drumming. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Trey let out a low chuckle, tilting his head slightly without looking over. "Well, well," Trey murmured. "Ain't seen you in a while, Malcolm. Thought you got too good for places like this." Malcolm exhaled through his nose. "Guess I'm feeling nostalgic." Trey finally turned his head, eyes flicking over Malcolm's bruises, the stiff way he held himself. His smirk faded just a little. "You look like you had a bad night." Malcolm didn't break eye contact. "Not as bad as the guys who started it." Trey nodded, taking a slow sip of his beer. "That why you're here?" Malcolm leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I need a name. Rico Vargas." Trey's face barely changed, but Malcolm caught the way his fingers twitched, the way his shoulders stiffened just a fraction before he forced himself to relax. He knew the name, and that meant Malcolm was on the right track. Trey let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You don't want to get mixed up with him, man." "I already am." Trey clicked his tongue, muttering a curse under his breath. He glanced around the bar, then back at Malcolm. "All right, fine. What do you want to know?" "Everything." Trey sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Rico ain't just some gangbanger. He's got his hands in a lot of pots. Runs crews all over the city, but he's careful about it. Doesn't get his hands dirty, not unless he has to. He's got people protecting him, Malcolm. Cops, politicians, business owners who like their money clean, but don't mind how it gets that way. He's not the kind of guy you just walk up on and take down." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "He's the one organizing the robberies, isn't he?" Trey hesitated. "He doesn't need the money. Not personally. But he's building something, and these jobs, they're a part of it." Malcolm leaned back slightly, letting that sink in. "Where's he operate?" Trey let out a slow breath. "His main hub is a nightclub over on West 14th, the Royale. It's not in his name, but everyone knows he owns it. That's where he meets people, handles business. But you're not getting in there without an invitation." Malcolm didn't respond immediately, turning the information over in his mind. If Rico was careful, then storming in wasn't an option. He needed to be smart about this. He needed a way inside. Trey watched him, shaking his head slightly. "Look, man, I know you. I know that look. You're not gonna let this go, are you?" "No." Trey sighed again, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Then do yourself a favor. Don't go in blind. Rico's got guys everywhere. You walk in there without a plan, you won't be walking out." Malcolm nodded slowly, taking one last sip of his drink before sliding a few bills across the bar. "Appreciate it, Trey." Trey didn't look happy, but he took the money, shaking his head. "Just don't get yourself killed." Malcolm stood, adjusting his coat as he made his way to the exit. He had what he needed now. A name, a location, a target. As he stepped out into the cold night air, the city stretched out before him, humming with the quiet undercurrent of things moving beneath the surface. He wasn't just dealing with a gang anymore. He was dealing with a machine, a system that had been built to keep men like Rico untouchable. But Malcolm had spent years taking down men who thought they were untouchable. And now, he was going to burn that system to the ground. But Malcolm had spent years taking down men who thought they were untouchable. Men who had built their power on fear, on the belief that no one would ever come for them. He had seen it before. Different countries, different uniforms, different languages. but it was always the same underneath. They all thought their money, their influence, their connections made them immune. They were always wrong. And now, standing in the cold night air with the Royale in his sights, Malcolm knew that Rico Vargas was just another name on a long list of men who believed they were above consequence. That belief had kept him comfortable. It had allowed him to grow his operation unchecked, to turn the city into his personal hunting ground, to send his men into Malcolm's store without the slightest hesitation, because they had never been given a reason to be afraid. Malcolm was about to change that. He moved with purpose, his footsteps measured as he made his way toward the nightclub's back alley. The Royale was more than just a front for Rico's operations. It was a fortress, a controlled environment where every move was watched, where the wrong question or the wrong face could mean disappearing without a trace. This wasn't some run-down hideout he could tear through with brute force. If he wanted in, he needed to be smart about it. The alley was dimly lit, a single flickering street lamp casting long shadows across the damp pavement. Two men stood by the back entrance, smoking, their conversation low and relaxed. They weren't on high alert, but they weren't completely checked out either. They were the kind of men who had spent enough time in this world to know trouble could come at any moment, but not enough to recognize when it was already standing in front of them. Malcolm didn't approach right away. He stood in the shadows, watching them, picking up on the small details. One of them was scrolling through his phone, distracted, only half listening to whatever his partner was saying. The other had his jacket unzipped, revealing the outline of a holstered weapon at his hip. Careless, too comfortable. They weren't expecting trouble. That was their mistake. Malcolm pulled out his phone, dialing the number he had lifted from the stolen goods listing he had found earlier. The second guard's phone vibrated. The man frowned, pulling it from his pocket, glancing at the screen with a confused expression before muttering something under his breath. His partner turned his head slightly, curious but not yet concerned. That second of distraction was all Malcolm needed. He moved fast, closing the distance between them in a controlled burst of speed. The first man barely had time to register the movement before Malcolm's elbow snapped forward, driving hard into his throat with precision. The impact sent him staggering backward, choking on his own breath as he collapsed against the wall, hands clutching his throat in a desperate attempt to suck in air. The second man reacted, reaching for his weapon, but Malcolm was already on him. His hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting sharply, forcing the gun free before it could be drawn. The weapon clattered to the ground, but Malcolm didn't let up. He followed through with a brutal knee to the ribs, then a quick, calculated strike to the temple. The man slumped against the bricks, groaning as he slid to the ground. Malcolm crouched beside him, grabbing a fistful of his shirt and pulling him in close. "How many inside?" His voice was calm, controlled. The man coughed, still dazed from the blow. I don't—" Malcolm slammed him back against the wall. Not enough to knock him out, just enough to make sure he understood there was only one right answer. "How many?" The man groaned, his eyes flickering with panic. "Maybe 10. 12 at most, not counting the staff." "Rico?" The hesitation lasted a second too long. Malcolm pressed his forearm harder against the man's chest. "He's here!" the man gasped. "Top floor. Office. But you're not—" Malcolm let him go, watching as he slumped forward, coughing. He wasn't interested in threats or warnings. He reached down, pulling the radio off the unconscious guard's belt and listening for activity. The channel was mostly quiet. No one had noticed the missing men yet. That wouldn't last. He needed to move. He grabbed a key card from the second man's jacket pocket, flipping it over in his fingers. The Royale logo was stamped onto the plastic, confirming what he had already guessed. This was his way in. Malcolm exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he stepped over the unconscious bodies and swiped the card against the door's scanner. The lock clicked open. He was inside. The hallway was narrow, lined with security cameras, but Malcolm had been in places like this before. He knew exactly where to walk, exactly how to angle his body to avoid being caught on the wrong lens. He moved quickly, keeping his steps light, staying close to the wall. The music from the club pulsed through the floors, bass heavy and deep, masking the subtle sounds of his movements. Past the kitchen, past the employee entrance, deeper into the belly of the building where the real business took place. He kept his focus forward, his mind already calculating his next steps. The Royale wasn't just some nightclub. It was a fortress for men who thought they were kings. And Malcolm was about to remind them what it felt like to bleed. Malcolm had spent years taking down men who thought they were untouchable. Men who had convinced themselves that their power made them immune. Men who had built their thrones out of intimidation and corruption, believing that as long as the right people were afraid of them, no one would ever come. Knocking on their door, he had seen it in war zones, in foreign cities where control was dictated by force rather than law, and he had seen it in places just like this. Men like Rico Vargas, who had never faced the kind of reckoning that made them question their own invincibility. That was about to change. Inside the Royale, the atmosphere shifted with every step deeper into the building. The first floor was a chaotic blend of music, flashing lights, and the dull roar of voices overlapping in conversation. It was a place built to distract, designed to make people feel untouchable, to make them forget about the world outside. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. The noise from the club below fading beneath thick walls and expensive carpeting, giving way to a space that felt calculated, intentional, a place where real business was conducted behind closed doors. Malcolm moved carefully, his posture relaxed but his senses sharp, his eyes scanning every detail. The placement of security cameras, the doors that required keycard access, the subtle signs that told him how this place operated. The private hallways of the Royale weren't cluttered with drunk patrons or loud conversations. The few people who moved through them did so with purpose, their pace slower, more deliberate. The lighting was dim but precise, casting everything in a low golden hue that gave it the illusion of warmth, but Malcolm could see the reality beneath it. This wasn't just an exclusive club, it was a fortress. He climbed the stairwell leading to the second floor, where the real power moved. The club's main level was for the customers, the outsiders, the people with money to spend and nothing to lose. Up here, it was different. The walls were lined with expensive artwork, the doors marked for private rooms, some closed, some slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of meetings, of quiet conversations, of people who weren't here for the music or the drinks. Then he heard it, a conversation. Low, firm voices, too deliberate to be casual. Malcolm slowed, stopping just short of a partially open door, his body shifting slightly to avoid the light spilling from inside. He could see enough to recognize Rico Vargas, seated behind an enormous glass desk, his posture comfortable, his expression unreadable. But the real problem sat across from him. A cop, not just some beat officer, not the kind who patrolled the streets in a squad car. This was someone higher up, older, well-dressed, a man who had been in the game long enough to know exactly how it worked. His suit was tailored, his movements slow, confident, like someone who wasn't worried about being caught in the wrong room with the wrong people. Malcolm kept still, listening. Already handled, Rico was saying, his tone smooth, assured, the kind of confidence that came from knowing no one would dare challenge him. The businesses that matter won't be a problem. The ones that pushed back, we made examples out of them. And the rest, well, they'll learn soon enough. The officer nodded slightly, reaching for the glass of whiskey in front of him, taking a slow sip before speaking. And the money? It'll be where it needs to be, Rico replied without hesitation. Same arrangement as always. The cop exhaled, setting his glass down with a soft clink against the desk. Then I suppose there's nothing to worry about. Malcolm's fingers curled at his sides. This wasn't just about street-level crime, about a gang roughing up businesses for quick cash. This was systemic, organized, protected. Rico wasn't just running a crew, he was running an operation, one that extended beyond the streets, beyond the clubs and the robberies, one that had hands inside the police department itself. Malcolm forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly, keeping his mind clear. He had the confirmation he needed, but he needed more than confirmation. He needed leverage. Pulling back from the door, he scanned the hallway quickly, eyes locking onto a smaller office nearby, slightly ajar, unguarded. He moved swiftly, slipping inside, closing the door behind him without a sound. The room was modest but expensive. A sleek desk took up most of the space, but it wasn't the furniture Malcolm cared about. His eyes went straight to the open ledger, sitting in the center of the desk. He stepped forward, flipping it open. Names, dates, transactions, and then his store. His jaw tightened as his eyes moved down the list. It wasn't just him. The names were all familiar. Businesses that had been hit, places he had passed by countless times. Some of them crossed off, some of them with notes written beside them in careful handwriting. Resistance, handled, future target. This wasn't about money. It was about control. The robberies were just a tool, a way to force people out, to drive them under, to weaken communities and replace them with something else. And the cops weren't just turning a blind eye. They were ensuring it happened. Malcolm let the realization settle deep into his bones. The cop wasn't there to shake Rico down. He was ensuring the operation ran smoothly. A noise outside the door made him freeze. The murmur of voices, the slow, deliberate click of expensive shoes against polished floors. The cop was leaving. Malcolm kept still, listening, waiting. He heard the door open, then close. Silence followed. But then, another voice. "What the hell are you doing in here?" Malcolm turned, his movements controlled, his muscles coiled in readiness. A guard stood in the doorway, his confusion already shifting into something sharper, his hand moving toward his belt. A radio, a weapon, something. Malcolm didn't give him the chance. He crossed the space between them in an instant, grabbing the man's collar and driving him backward into the hallway wall with force, the impact sending a sharp thud through the quiet corridor. The guard grunted, trying to react, but Malcolm's fist cracked against his jaw before he could do anything more than gasp. Another guard appeared, bigger, heavier, already reaching for a weapon. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He caught the man's wrist before he could draw, twisted hard, sent the gun skidding across the floor. A sharp elbow to the temple followed, knocking the second man against the door frame. A door at the end of the hall swung open. Rico Vargas stepped out. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rico's eyes flickered between Malcolm and the two groaning men on the ground, then toward the open office door. The understanding settled in quickly. A smirk pulled at the corner of his lips. "Well, well," Rico murmured, sliding a hand into his jacket. "Didn't think you'd be stupid enough to come here yourself." Malcolm exhaled slowly, his posture steady, his fists still clenched at his sides. There was no point in talking, because this fight had already begun. The moment Rico's hand disappeared into his jacket, Malcolm was already moving, instincts taking over, years of training kicking in like a second skin. There was no hesitation, no time to wait and see what Rico was reaching for. Malcolm closed the distance between them in an instant, his foot planting hard as he drove a punch straight toward Rico's ribs, twisting his body into the strike. Rico barely dodged in time, staggering back, his hand yanking out a switchblade, the sharp metallic snap echoing in the narrow hallway. His smirk widened, something predatory flickering in his eyes. "Oh, you got some fight in you," Rico taunted, flipping the blade between his fingers. Malcolm didn't answer. He wasn't here to trade words. The first slash came fast. Rico wasn't swinging wildly. He knew how to use a knife, keeping the blade low, tight to his body, angling for Malcolm's ribs. Malcolm twisted just in time, feeling the whisper of metal slice through the fabric of his jacket, too close for comfort. Then, the rest of them came. The door to Rico's office slammed open, and 3 more men rushed into the hallway, their movements sharp and aggressive, closing in fast. Malcolm barely had time to register the numbers before one of them tackled him hard, driving him back against the wall, the impact rattling through his ribs. A second set of hands grabbed at his arm, trying to pin him down, while the third cocked back a fist, aiming for his face. Malcolm reacted on instinct. He yanked his arm free, snapped his head forward, and drove his forehead straight into the nose of the man gripping him. The crunch of cartilage was immediate, followed by a howl of pain as the guy staggered back, blood spilling down his face. But there was no time to celebrate. Another fist crashed into Malcolm's jaw, snapping his head sideways. White-hot pain exploded across his vision. His brain barely had time to process the hit before another blow slammed into his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. They were fast, coordinated, brutal. Rico was smart enough to surround himself with men who could fight. These weren't just street thugs. They had been trained for this. Malcolm gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay standing, forcing himself to move. A second punch came, aiming for his stomach. He twisted at the last second, grabbing the attacker's arm and using his own momentum against him. With a sharp pivot, he swung the man around, driving him shoulder first into the wall, the impact hard enough to crack the drywall. No time to breathe. The second guy lunged, throwing a wild haymaker. Malcolm ducked low, dropping into a crouch, and swept his leg out hard, kicking the man's knee from under him. The guy crumpled, but before Malcolm could follow through, a sharp pain seared across his arm. The knife. Rico's blade had grazed his forearm. The sting immediate, hot blood slicking his sleeve. Malcolm barely registered the pain before Rico was coming at him again, the blade flashing under the dim hallway lights. Malcolm feinted left, baiting Rico into overextending, then slammed a vicious elbow into his ribs, followed by a sharp hook to his jaw. Rico stumbled, but he recovered fast, too fast, the knife slashing upward. Malcolm barely pulled back in time, feeling the blade slice a shallow line just beneath his collarbone. Then a third man slammed into him from behind, wrapping thick arms around his torso, trying to restrain him. Malcolm snarled, planting his feet and driving his head backward, smashing into the man's face. The grip loosened for half a second, all he needed. Malcolm grabbed one of the guy's arms, twisting it at an unnatural angle before slamming him hard against the opposite wall. The second guy had recovered by then, lunging toward Malcolm's side. Malcolm stepped in close, trapping the attacker's arm and pivoting his body into a brutal shoulder throw, sending the man crashing onto the hallway floor. Another punch came, a heavy swing aimed for his ribs. Malcolm caught it mid-air, twisting the guy's wrist and yanking him forward, using his own momentum to slam him against the office door frame. The room was wrecked now, bodies struggling to push back to their feet, the scent of blood mixing with sweat, the sound of heavy breathing filling the space. Rico wiped at his split lip, his breathing uneven but still cocky. He wasn't afraid, but he was angry. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Rico exhaled, rolling his shoulders, his switchblade still gleaming in his grip. Malcolm flexed his fingers, shaking the tension from his bruised knuckles. His body ached. His breathing was heavier than he wanted it to be. But he was still standing, and Rico could see that. The moment of tension stretched between them, both men staring each other down. Then Rico flicked his wrist, signaling something. Footsteps. More of them. Malcolm didn't turn to look. He already knew. More men were coming, and he had to be ready. The fight was far from over. The moment Rico flicked his wrist, signaling for reinforcements, Malcolm's mind sharpened with focus, his body already moving before his thoughts had fully caught up. He couldn't let himself get boxed in. The Royale was still enemy territory, and no matter how skilled he was, numbers would eventually win out if he let himself get trapped. The thudding of footsteps echoed from both ends of the hallway, new figures rushing into view, their expressions shifting from surprise to violent intent as they registered the scene. The bodies on the floor, the blood splattered along the walls, the damage already done. Malcolm couldn't afford to hesitate. The first man to reach him swung wildly, trying to overwhelm him with sheer force. Malcolm sidestepped, grabbing the attacker's wrist and twisting hard, forcing him to pivot as pain shot through his arm. The man yelped, trying to break free, but Malcolm was already moving, driving a vicious elbow into his ribs, following up with a knee to the gut that sent him crumpling to the ground. Another lunged from behind, but Malcolm had been waiting for him. He shifted his weight, allowing the attacker's own momentum to work against him. As soon as he felt the arm trying to wrap around his neck, he dropped his center of gravity, using his strength to flip the man over his shoulder and slam him onto the hard floor. The impact was brutal, knocking the wind out of him instantly. 2 down, more coming. A sharp whistle from Rico caught Malcolm's attention just in time to see the gang leader smirking, already backing toward the far end of the hall. He wasn't staying to finish the fight. He was leaving his men to handle it while he slipped away. Coward. Malcolm gritted his teeth, forcing himself to make a choice. Chase Rico now? Risk getting overwhelmed? Or finish this fight first, secure what he needed, and catch up later? The answer came when another attacker swung at him with a broken chair leg, aiming for his ribs. Malcolm barely dodged in time, feeling the wood graze his arm. Enough. He didn't have time for finesse anymore. He caught the attacker's wrist mid-swing, yanking him forward before slamming his forearm into the man's throat, crushing his windpipe with surgical precision. The attacker choked, staggering backward, but Malcolm was already moving on, catching the next opponent by the lapels and driving him headfirst into the nearby wall. The sickening crack of impact signaled another one down. 3 left standing. One of them, a stocky man with tattoos running up his arms, drew a knife, his stance low, confident, his grip steady. Unlike Rico, this one actually knew how to use it. Malcolm didn't give him the chance. As the man lunged, Malcolm sidestepped sharply, grabbing the attacker's wrist with one hand, while his other slammed down onto the man's elbow, forcing the knife to drop. In the same motion, Malcolm wrenched the man's arm behind his back, driving him face first into the nearest table. Glass shattered as the man collapsed, unmoving. 2 left. They hesitated now, shifting their stance, their eyes darting to each other, silently asking if this fight was still worth it. Malcolm saw the moment their courage broke. "Yeah," he muttered, voice steady despite the burning in his muscles. "Didn't think so." One turned and ran. The other followed a second later. Cowards. But Malcolm didn't have time to enjoy the victory. Rico was gone. He exhaled sharply, shaking the tension from his bruised knuckles, his eyes scanning the wreckage. He needed something, anything, that could tell him where Rico was heading. That's when he spotted it, the open ledger on the desk, its pages fluttering from the wind of a broken window. He moved quickly, flipping through it, his eyes scanning names, numbers, locations. Some of it was coded, meant to obscure the real transactions, but Malcolm had dealt with enough organized operations to recognize patterns, connections. Then he saw it. A warehouse, Pier 32. A date. A time. Tonight. It wasn't just a location. It was a meeting. His pulse steadied, his mind already shifting gears. This was bigger than just a robbery crew. This was an operation, and whatever was happening at that warehouse, Rico was planning to be there. Malcolm didn't waste another second. He grabbed a disposable phone off the desk, one of the cheap burner models used for temporary calls, and pocketed it before heading for the nearest exit. Rico thought he had gotten away. He was wrong. Malcolm had just found his next target, and this time, he wasn't walking in alone. Malcolm moved quickly through the city streets, his pulse steady despite the lingering burn in his muscles. The Royale was behind him now, but the fight had only just begun. The ledger in his mind was more than just names and numbers. It was proof. It was a roadmap to Rico's entire operation, and the meeting at Pier 32 was the next step in unraveling it. But he wasn't naive. He couldn't do this alone. Rico had protection, not just from his crew, but from the police. That much had been made clear. The officer he had seen in Rico's office hadn't just been turning a blind eye. He had been part of the machine. That meant if Malcolm moved recklessly, If he made a wrong call and got the wrong set of eyes on this, everything could disappear. The evidence would be buried. The warehouse would be scrubbed clean before he ever got there. He needed a cop he could trust. The problem was, he wasn't sure there were any left. Malcolm didn't go straight to the pier. He couldn't afford to. He needed to be sure before he made his next move, which meant finding one cop who wasn't on Rico's payroll. There was only one name that came to mind: Detective Lisa Carter. She had been around long enough to see the shift in the city. The way certain neighborhoods got left behind, the way cases involving certain victims were buried under paperwork, the way certain criminals never seemed to get caught, no matter how many witnesses pointed fingers. She had been one of the few who had actually given a damn. But that didn't mean she wasn't compromised. If Rico had influence this deep, he couldn't assume anyone was clean. Malcolm made his way toward a 24-hour diner on the east side of town, a place he knew Carter sometimes stopped for coffee when working late cases. It wasn't a precinct, it wasn't her home, and most importantly, it wasn't somewhere Rico's men would expect him to go. The place was nearly empty when he stepped inside, the smell of burnt coffee and stale grease hanging in the air. A waitress glanced up from behind the counter, barely registering him before turning back to her magazine. Lisa was sitting in a booth near the back, a cup of coffee in front of her, a folder open on the table. Malcolm approached without hesitation. She didn't look up, but he saw the slight shift in her posture. The way her hand twitched toward the holster hidden beneath her blazer, the way her eyes flicked toward the diner's reflection in the window, before finally landing on him. "You look like hell," she muttered, flipping a page in her file. "Feels worse than it looks." Malcolm slid into the seat across from her, keeping his voice low. She studied him for a moment before setting the file aside. "I heard about your store." Malcolm exhaled through his nose. "Then you already know why I'm here." Lisa leaned back slightly, fingers tapping against her cup. "Depends. Are you here to ask for help? Or are you here to tell me something you shouldn't know?" Malcolm let the silence settle between them before speaking. "Rico Vargas. The robberies, the break-ins, the businesses getting hit. It's all coordinated. It's not about money. It's about control." Lisa's expression didn't change, but he saw the way her fingers tensed against the ceramic of her cup. "I need to know if you're clean," Malcolm said, his voice calm, steady. "Because if you're not, I'll walk away, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened." Lisa's jaw tightened. "And if I am?" Malcolm leaned in slightly. "Then you're going to help me take him down." Lisa let out a slow breath, her gaze flickering toward the entrance before settling back on him. "You don't get to just take him down, Malcolm. This isn't some street-level bust. Rico's got protection. The kind of protection that gets people disappeared when they start asking questions." "I know." Malcolm met her gaze, unwavering. "That's why I need to know if I can trust you." Lisa didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for her coffee, taking a slow sip, her eyes never leaving his. When she finally set the cup down, her voice was lower, quieter. "I put in a request for an investigation on Rico 6 months ago," she admitted. "It went nowhere. Files went missing. Witnesses recanted. And then I got warned to back off." "By who?" Lisa hesitated. "Internal Affairs." Malcolm frowned. "They should be the ones investigating this." Lisa gave a dry laugh. "You'd think. But IA isn't clean either. Someone high up shut it down. I don't know who, but the message was clear. This case wasn't supposed to move forward." Malcolm let that sink in. "If you know all this, why are you still sitting here?" he asked. "Because I don't have proof," she exhaled sharply. "Everything I dig up disappears before I can act on it. And if I make a wrong move, I get transferred. Or worse." Malcolm nodded slowly. "I have proof." Lisa's eyes sharpened. "What kind of proof?" Malcolm glanced toward the window, making sure they weren't being watched. "Ledger, transactions, names, evidence that ties Rico to businesses being targeted, and names of cops who are making sure it happens." Lisa's expression darkened. "Where is it?" "I couldn't take it. But I know where to find it again." She was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "You really want to do this?" Malcolm didn't blink. "You already know the answer." Lisa nodded once. Then she pulled a small notepad from her pocket, scribbled something down, and slid it across the table to him. "That's my burner number," she said. "You call me when you're ready to move. But until then, I was never here. This conversation never happened. If you make a wrong step, they'll make sure neither of us walks away from it." Malcolm took the paper, pocketing it without a word. Lisa picked up her coffee again, taking a slow sip before muttering, "You're going after him tonight, aren't you?" Malcolm smirked faintly. "What gave it away?" Lisa shook her head. "Just don't get yourself killed before I get my shot at taking these guys down." Malcolm stood, adjusting his jacket as he glanced toward the diner's entrance. "Wouldn't dream of it." With that, he stepped out into the night, the city stretching out before him. He had a plan. He had an ally, and now he had a target. Pier 32 was waiting. Malcolm moved through the city with purpose, his mind laser-focused on what was coming next. The streets were quieter now, the late-night lull settling over the buildings like a heavy blanket, but the stillness was deceptive. Beneath it, things were moving, shifting, preparing. Rico Vargas was heading to Pier 32 for a reason, and Malcolm was going to find out what it was. The meeting wasn't just a routine drop-off. Too much money, too many moving parts. Rico wasn't some small-time player making a deal in the shadows. He was running something bigger, something that required cooperation from police, politicians, and criminals alike. Whatever was happening at that warehouse, it wasn't just another piece of the puzzle. It was the center of it, and Malcolm needed to be there before the night was over. The industrial docks on Pier 32 stretched out against the water, old shipping containers stacked like forgotten relics under the flickering glow of overhead floodlights. The place was mostly abandoned at this hour, only a few trucks stationed in the distance, their drivers either sleeping in their cabs or handling quiet, unseen business of their own. Malcolm had parked 2 blocks away, approaching on foot, moving carefully through the maze of steel and concrete. He had spent enough time in places like this to know how to read them, the layout, the sight lines, the escape routes. He mapped them out in his head as he moved, cataloging every possible advantage. Then he saw them. 2 black SUVs parked near the entrance to an old warehouse, their engines still running, headlights off. Men stood nearby, shifting in place, alert but not on high alert, like they weren't expecting trouble, but knew better than to completely relax. Security. Not just a couple of guys standing around. Professionals. These men weren't street muscle. Their stances were too disciplined, their movements too controlled. Rico hadn't just brought his usual crew tonight. He had brought the people he trusted the most. Malcolm exhaled slowly, scanning the scene. The warehouse itself was massive, a 2-story structure with rusted steel walls and a long row of high windows near the ceiling. The front entrance was out of the question. Too many eyes? Too many guns? But the side doors? Possible. The loading dock? Better. He moved quickly, keeping low, using the maze of containers as cover as he made his way toward the back of the warehouse. There was an old maintenance ladder bolted to the side, leading up toward the roof, its paint chipped and rusting at the edges. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. Climbing swiftly, he reached the top in seconds, his hands gripping the edge of the structure as he pulled himself up and onto the roof. The wind was stronger here, carrying the faint scent of oil and salt water, the distant hum of the city blending with the lapping of waves against the docks. Malcolm moved carefully, stepping over rusted beams, staying in the shadows as he reached a skylight near the center of the roof. He crouched low, peering through the glass, his pulse steady but focused. Inside, the warehouse was a hive of activity. There were at least a dozen men inside, some standing guard, others moving between stacks of crates marked with shipping labels from multiple companies. Smuggling, that much was clear. But what they were moving, that was the real question. Malcolm's eyes flicked toward the center of the warehouse, where Rico Vargas stood in front of a table covered in paperwork, a map spread out beneath his hands. He was talking to someone, a man Malcolm didn't recognize. The guy was tall, mid-40s, dressed in a dark suit that didn't quite fit with the surroundings. Not one of Rico's usual men. His posture was too stiff, too controlled, like he wasn't used to dealing with people like this. This wasn't a simple exchange. Malcolm shifted his angle, trying to read their lips, catching fragments of their conversation through the hum of machinery and distant voices. Shipments coming in from overseas. Need to move faster. Cops won't interfere as long as we keep paying. We have to clean up the loose ends. Malcolm narrowed his eyes, his body tensing slightly. This wasn't just about stolen goods. Then he saw something that made his pulse quicken. One of the crates had been pried open, its contents partially exposed. Inside, beneath a layer of packing material, was a cache of weapons. Assault rifles, pistols, enough firepower to supply a small army. Malcolm exhaled slowly, his mind clicking into place. This wasn't just about money. Rico wasn't just running a robbery crew, he was running weapons, moving high-grade firepower through the city, keeping the streets armed while lining his pockets. And now, with the police on his payroll, he was untouchable. Malcolm needed to act. But before he could make his move, the warehouse door opened. A new figure stepped inside, and this time, Malcolm recognized him immediately, the corrupt cop from the Royale. The man strolled in like he belonged there, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Rico. The two exchanged a quick handshake, casual, practiced. This wasn't their first meeting. Malcolm's grip on the edge of the skylight tightened. Rico wasn't just buying police silence. He was working directly with them. The cop pulled a small envelope from his pocket, tossing it onto the table. Rico flipped it open, scanned whatever was inside, then nodded. Malcolm had seen enough. His original plan had been to gather intel, to wait and strike when the time was right. But this changed everything. If he let this deal go through, if he let these weapons hit the streets, more innocent people would suffer. He wasn't waiting anymore. Malcolm pulled his phone from his pocket and typed a message to Detective Carter. Weapons deal at Pier 32. I have eyes on Rico and the dirty cop. If we don't move now, we lose everything. He hesitated for a brief second, then added, You wanted proof? I'm about to get it. He hit send. Then, without another moment's hesitation, Malcolm reached for the crowbar strapped to his back, pried the skylight open just enough to slip through, and dropped silently into the shadows below. The fight was coming. And this time, he wasn't leaving until Rico's entire operation was burned to the ground. Malcolm landed in a crouch, his boots absorbing the impact as he touched down on the cold concrete floor. The warehouse smelled of oil, rust, and damp wood, a mixture of the old dockyard and the illicit business being carried out inside. He moved quickly, slipping between crates and stacks of smuggled cargo, keeping his body low and his steps light. The space was alive with movement. Men shifting supplies, exchanging orders in hushed tones, crates being pried open to inspect their contents. This wasn't just a smuggling operation, it was an entire network, a pipeline that Rico had built with military efficiency. Malcolm saw weapons, stacks of bundled cash, bricks of narcotics wrapped in plastic, all carefully packed and ready to be moved. At the center of it all stood Rico Vargas. He was leaning over a table, scanning the map spread out in front of him, while speaking with a suited man who didn't fit the usual profile of a street criminal. Malcolm didn't recognize him, but the way Rico listened told him everything. This man had power. A few feet away, the corrupt cop from the Royale stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture deceptively casual. Malcolm crept closer, pressing himself behind a stack of metal containers. He strained to hear the conversation over the steady hum of the warehouse. Shipment's late, the cop muttered. Rico shook his head, still studying the map. It'll get here, and if it doesn't, then we make adjustments. Rico's voice carried the calm of a man who had been in this business long enough to know that everything could be solved with enough money and the right amount of pressure. The cops stay paid, the streets stay quiet, and we keep moving product. What do you think is going to happen? Someone going to stop me? The cop exhaled slowly. This many businesses getting hit, this much weight moving through the docks? It's risky. Everything is risky, Rico replied, finally looking up, He gestured toward the cop with a smirk. "That's why I keep you around." Malcolm clenched his fists. This wasn't just corruption. It was coordination. Rico wasn't bribing people to look the other way. He was working with them. If Malcolm had any doubts about how deep this ran, they were gone now. He pulled out his phone, lifted it just enough to get a clean shot, and snapped a photo. It captured everything. Rico, the cop, the map, the crates filled with weapons and narcotics. He attached the image to a message for Detective Carter. Pier 32. It's all here. Get here now. The moment the message was sent, he shoved the phone back into his pocket and moved. He reached his first target quickly. The guard was standing near a stack of crates, idly checking his phone. Malcolm slipped in behind him, wrapped an arm around his throat, and dragged him backward into the shadows. The man struggled, his body jerking in resistance, but Malcolm's grip was firm, cutting off his air until the fight left him completely. Malcolm lowered him carefully, stripped his radio, and melted back into the darkness. Then his luck ran out. A loose crate teetered as he stepped past it, and before he could catch it, the wooden planks crashed onto the concrete with a loud, splintering crack. The warehouse froze. Then, "Over there!" gunfire erupted. Bullets punched through the stacks of cargo around him, sending splinters flying as Malcolm threw himself behind a steel container, his body reacting before his mind fully caught up. Shouts filled the air as men scrambled, their voices sharp and urgent. "Find him! Block the exits!" Malcolm pressed his back against the cold steel, his breathing slow and controlled. He was pinned down. A voice rang out over the chaos. "Rico's. I don't know who the hell you are," he called out, his voice laced with irritation more than fear. "But you just walked into the wrong warehouse." Malcolm didn't answer. He wasn't giving up his position. Another burst of gunfire tore through the crates to his left. "You with one of those dumbass store owners?" Rico continued, his voice carrying over the commotion. "You think I don't know people are pissed off? That I don't know some of them would rather die than fall in line?" Malcolm clenched his jaw. "I don't care who you are," Rico went on, his voice still calm, still sure. "But you made a mistake. You didn't bring enough people for this fight." He was right. Malcolm had one magazine, no body armor, and a dozen trained men closing in on him. He wasn't walking out of here unless something changed. He glanced at his phone. No reply from Carter. No sign of backup. The boots outside were getting closer. He could hear the safeties clicking off, the rustle of fabric as men positioned themselves for an ambush. He needed to disappear. Slowly, carefully, Malcolm reached for a metal pipe lying nearby and hurled it toward a stack of crates across the room. The impact was loud, sending wood crashing to the ground. "There! Move!" As soon as they turned, Malcolm slipped out of cover, sprinting low toward a small storage room against the far wall. He dove inside, shutting the door behind him just as bullets shredded the crates he had been standing behind seconds earlier. The space was cramped and dark, filled with old equipment and stacked boxes. There was no way out, except for a rusted ventilation shaft near the ceiling, too small to squeeze through. Trapped. Heavy boots pounded outside. "He's in there!" "Barricade the exits." "He's not getting out." Malcolm's breathing stayed steady, despite the tension in his muscles. They thought they had him. For now, they did. But they didn't know about the message he had sent. They didn't know help was already on the way. Malcolm lowered himself onto one knee, shifting behind a stack of boxes, keeping his silhouette low, his mind calculating his next move. He just needed to hold out long enough for the storm to hit, long enough for Rico Vargas to realize this time he wasn't getting away. Malcolm remained crouched behind a stack of crates, his body tense, every muscle coiled and ready to react the moment an opportunity presented itself. He could hear the voices just beyond the storage room, their tones shifting between impatience and calculation. The men outside knew they had him trapped, and rather than rush in blindly, they were taking their time, deciding on the best way to force him into the open. "They got him pinned," one of them muttered, his voice low but clear. "We just need to flush him out. Or we wait," another suggested. Let him sweat it out. He's not going anywhere. Malcolm's grip on the pistol remained firm, his knuckles tightening as he weighed his options. He didn't have the luxury of waiting, not when every second that passed gave them more time to box him in. His ammunition was limited, and he had no guarantee that an opening would present itself. Then, suddenly, something changed. A new sound cut through the warehouse, piercing the stillness with an unmistakable presence: the rising wail of police sirens. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. "What was that?" one of the men outside asked, his voice sharp with confusion. "Cops?" another muttered, and though he tried to sound composed, there was an unmistakable edge of unease in his tone. Malcolm let out a slow, controlled breath, his shoulders easing just slightly as he processed the new variable. Carter came through. Outside the warehouse, the sound of vehicles skidding to a stop filled the air, followed by the heavy slam of car doors as officers took position. Then, over a loudspeaker, Detective Lisa Carter's voice rang out, steady and commanding. "This is Detective Lisa Carter. Everyone inside the warehouse, drop your weapons and put your hands where we can see them." For a brief moment, there was silence, the kind that stretched taut with tension, the kind that signaled a decision being made. Then, just as quickly, the warehouse exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted as Rico's men chose to fight instead of surrender. The air filled with the sharp cracks of bullets tearing through wooden crates, sending splinters flying in every direction. Shouting overlapped with the metallic clang of equipment being knocked over as men scrambled for cover. The tide of the battle had turned, but it had not yet ended. Malcolm didn't waste the opportunity. He kicked open the storage room door and stepped into the fray, moving with purpose. The first guard he encountered barely had time to react before Malcolm knocked him aside, using his own momentum against him to send him sprawling onto the concrete. Another turned toward him, caught off guard by the sudden emergence, but Malcolm was already one step ahead, closing the distance before the man could raise his weapon. The fight inside the warehouse had spread like wildfire. Carter's officers had breached the front entrance, moving in tight formation as they worked their way through the building, pushing Rico's men back with controlled bursts of gunfire. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the warehouse as law enforcement advanced, methodically cutting off escape routes and overwhelming the gang's defenses. Malcolm barely registered any of it. His focus remained locked on Rico Vargas. The gang leader was no longer at the table where he had been standing moments ago. He had already begun moving, his expression set, his posture rigid as he made his way toward the side exit. His men were still engaged in the fight, but Rico had no intention of staying. A short distance away, Carter had locked onto her own target, the corrupt cop. "You're not going anywhere," she shouted, her voice carrying above the commotion. The officer turned sharply, his expression flickering between anger and realization. He hesitated only for a moment before raising his weapon, but Carter was faster. A single shot rang out, echoing through the warehouse, and the officer stumbled backward, his leg giving out beneath him as he crashed against a stack of crates, his weapon slipping from his grasp. "Stay down," Carter ordered, moving in closer. Malcolm had no time to see what happened next. His attention snapped back to Rico, who had reached the exit. "Vargas!" Malcolm called out, his voice cutting through the noise. Rico turned, raised his gun, and fired. Malcolm barely had time to react as he ducked, feeling the bullet slice through the air just past his shoulder. He didn't stop moving. Rico was fast, but Malcolm was faster. He lunged forward, closing the gap between them just as Rico reached the warehouse doors. They crashed onto the loading dock, tumbling across the pavement in a struggle for control. Malcolm was the first to get back on his feet, his breath steady despite the exertion. "You just don't quit, do you?" Rico muttered, wiping the back of his hand across his face, his voice edged with irritation rather than fear. Malcolm didn't look away. "Neither do you." Rico lunged. They collided once again, their movements locked in a test of control rather than brute force. Rico threw a wild punch, but Malcolm sidestepped, countering with a firm shove that sent him off balance. Rico caught himself, his stance shifting as he tried to reach for something at his waist. But Malcolm was already there, stopping him before he could pull the weapon free. "You're done," Malcolm said, his voice firm but even. Rico stiffened, his body coiled with tension. Then he smirked. A gunshot rang out from inside the warehouse. Carter. Malcolm's head snapped toward the noise for a fraction of a second. That was all Rico needed. In one swift motion, he twisted out of Malcolm's grip, breaking free before sprinting toward the docks. Malcolm straightened quickly, his body still tense from the fight. Rico was running. And now, with most of his men scattered or subdued, his only way out was the water. Malcolm exhaled sharply, shaking the stiffness from his limbs as he set his eyes on the fleeing gang leader. Then, without another second's hesitation, he took off after him. This was it. Rico wasn't escaping this time. Malcolm pushed himself forward, his strides long and controlled as he chased Rico across the dock. The cold night air bit at his skin, the scent of salt and diesel filling his lungs. The water stretched out ahead, dark and restless beneath the dim glow of the dock lights. Rico wasn't running toward an escape. He was running out of options. Malcolm closed the distance, his boots pounding against the wooden planks. Rico's breathing was ragged, his movements sharp but desperate, his usual confidence starting to crack. He had always controlled the fight from a distance, always relied on his men, his power, his influence. But now, with no backup and nowhere left to run, it was just him and Malcolm. "Vargas!" Malcolm called out, his voice steady. Rico didn't turn, didn't stop, but he did hesitate. It was enough. Malcolm lunged, grabbing him by the collar and pulling him back hard. The sudden force sent them both tumbling onto the dock, rolling over the damp wood, struggling for control. Rico twisted, trying to break free, but Malcolm tightened his grip, pulling him back down. Rico swung first, his fist cutting through the air, aiming for Malcolm's ribs. Malcolm blocked it, deflecting the hit before driving his shoulder forward, knocking Rico off balance. They grappled, both using their weight to gain leverage, both refusing to go down. Rico shoved hard, breaking Malcolm's hold for a second. He stumbled backward, but recovered fast, throwing another punch. This time, it connected. A sharp blow to Malcolm's side. Pain flared through his ribs, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to let it slow him down. He stepped in close, catching Rico's arm mid-swing and twisting it slightly. Not enough to break anything, just enough to throw him off. Rico let out a sharp breath, his stance shifting as he tried to counter. He was strong, but his technique was rough, aggressive, but imprecise. He fought like someone used to winning through force, through intimidation. Malcolm had fought men like him before. Rico tried to lunge forward again, but Malcolm caught him, using his own momentum to drive him back against a stack of wooden crates. The impact knocked the air out of him, and before he could recover, Malcolm pressed his forearm against his chest, holding him in place. "You're done," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. Rico struggled, his breath coming in short, quick bursts. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think locking me up is going to stop this?" Malcolm tightened his hold just slightly. "You're right," he admitted. "This alone won't stop it, but it's a start." Rico let out a sharp, humorless laugh, but the fight was already draining from his body. He knew it. Malcolm knew it. Malcolm stepped back slightly, giving him just enough room to move, but not enough to run. Rico didn't try. He just stared at him, eyes burning with a mix of exhaustion and defiance. "You lost," Malcolm said simply. Rico didn't respond, just exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. Without another word, Malcolm grabbed his arm, pulling him forward as they made their way back toward the warehouse. Rico resisted at first, but it was weak, more for pride than any real attempt at escape. As they stepped back onto the loading dock, Malcolm took in the scene that had unfolded in his absence. The fight inside the warehouse was over. Carter's officers had secured the area, their presence now dominating the space. Most of Rico's men were either on the ground in cuffs or standing with their hands behind their heads, surrounded by officers. The ones still conscious were being led away toward waiting squad cars, their heads lowered, their defiance stripped away. Carter stood near the warehouse entrance, her gaze sweeping across the scene, her expression cool but focused. The corrupt cop, the one Malcolm had seen working with Rico, was sitting against a crate, his leg bandaged, his hands cuffed behind his back. His face was pale, his eyes distant, like he was only just realizing the full weight of what had happened. Malcolm stopped at the edge of the warehouse, still gripping Rico's arm. Carter turned at the sound of their footsteps, her eyes locking onto Rico first, then flicking up to Malcolm. She took in the state of them. Bruised, battered, but both standing. "Didn't run far, huh?" Carter said, crossing her arms. Malcolm gave a tired smirk. "Didn't get the chance." Rico exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping just slightly, but he didn't speak. Carter stepped forward, nodding toward the officers waiting nearby. Two of them moved in, taking Rico from Malcolm's grip, securing him in cuffs before leading him toward one of the waiting vehicles. Malcolm let his arms fall to his sides, the weight of the night starting to settle into his muscles. Carter studied him for a moment. "You all right?" He exhaled, rolling his shoulders slightly. "I will be." Carter nodded, her gaze shifting back toward the scene in front of them. The warehouse was secured. The operation was done. The people who thought they were untouchable were finally in chains. For the first time in a long time, Malcolm allowed himself to believe that this fight, at least, had been won. The flashing red and blue lights cast long shadows across the docks, the chaos of the past hour settling into something quieter, more controlled. The fight was over. The shouting had died down, and now the night was filled with the steady rhythm of radio chatter and the occasional clank of handcuffs securing another one of Rico's men. Malcolm stood near the entrance of the warehouse, watching as officers moved efficiently through the scene, logging evidence, securing statements, and loading the arrested men into police transport. The tension that had been in his body for hours finally began to unwind, though the exhaustion was starting to settle in its place. Carter walked up beside him, her hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the scene. "Not bad for one night's work," she said. Malcolm huffed a quiet breath, shaking his head. "I've had worse." She smirked, but didn't argue. A few feet away, Rico sat in the back of a police cruiser, his expression unreadable. His suit was torn, his face bruised from the struggle on the docks, but he wasn't saying a word. His gaze remained forward, locked on some distant point beyond the flashing lights. "He's not talking," Carter said, following Malcolm's eyes. "Not yet, anyway." Malcolm turned to her. "Doesn't matter. You've got enough to put him away." Carter nodded. "More than enough. Between the warehouse full of contraband, the paper trail you helped expose, and a long list of charges that include arms trafficking, drug distribution, racketeering, and conspiracy, he's looking at a lifetime behind bars." Malcolm let that sink in. Rico had built himself up as an untouchable figure, someone who could buy his way out of anything. But now, he had nowhere left to run. "And his crew?" Malcolm asked, scanning the faces of the men being processed. "Most of them will roll over," Carter said with certainty. "They know Rico's finished. The smart ones will take deals, the rest will go down with him." Malcolm didn't doubt it. Without Rico calling the shots, his operation would collapse on itself. He had relied too much on fear and control, and once that control was broken, there was nothing left holding it together. Carter's expression darkened slightly. "The bigger issue is the cops that were involved." Malcolm looked at her. "We've already identified 3 officers with clear connections to Rico," she continued. "The one from the Royale is going down first. He knows it. IA's already moving to make sure no one tries to bury the case." She exhaled, rolling her shoulders slightly. "It won't be easy, but we'll clean house. Might take time, but this is going all the way up." Malcolm could hear the weight in her voice. Corruption in the department wasn't just one bad cop looking the other way. It was a network, and networks didn't disappear overnight. "You sure they'll let you keep pushing this?" he asked. Carter gave him a tired smile. They don't have a choice now. It's too big to ignore. She nodded toward the warehouse. Besides, the evidence speaks for itself. Malcolm followed her gaze. Inside the now empty warehouse, rows of confiscated crates had been opened and catalogued. Officers were moving through them, logging everything for the official report. Some were filled with illegal weapons, others packed with drugs ready for distribution. But then, near the back of the warehouse, Malcolm spotted something that made his jaw tighten. His stolen goods, the familiar sight of expensive watches, jewelry cases, and high-end merchandise, sat in an open container, dumped carelessly among the contraband. It was a stark reminder of how this had all started. A robbery that had led to something much bigger. Malcolm stepped forward, running a hand over one of the display cases, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. Carter appeared beside him. Yours? He nodded. Most of it. She glanced at the officer logging the inventory. Make sure this is returned to its rightful owner, she instructed. The officer nodded. Already marking it for return. Store names on most of the receipts. Malcolm exhaled slowly, watching as the officer carefully repacked the goods. It wasn't about the money. It was about what had been taken from him. The violation. The assumption that he was just another target. And now, he had taken it back. Carter crossed her arms. You ever think about switching careers? Law enforcement could use someone like you. Malcolm let out a quiet laugh. I think I've had enough of fighting battles that never seem to end. Carter smirked. Fair enough. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the last of Rico's men were loaded into transport vehicles. The warehouse, once a hub of illegal activity, was now just a crime scene. A piece of a dismantled empire that would never rise again. For the first time in a long time, Malcolm felt like something had truly changed. He turned back to Carter. Guess this means we're done here. Carter nodded. For tonight? Then, with a knowing look, she added, but you and I both know this isn't the last fight. Malcolm glanced back at Rico's cruiser as it pulled away, sirens blaring. No, he admitted, but it's a good start. The city had settled into quiet by the time Malcolm arrived back at his store. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car passing through, headlights washing over the storefront before disappearing into the distance. The night air carried a coolness that felt sharper now, the adrenaline that had kept him going for hours finally wearing off. He parked at the curb, letting the engine idle for a moment as he stared through the windshield at Reed & Co. Fine Jewelry. The sign above the door still flickered slightly, one of the bulbs struggling to hold on. The damage from the break-in had been repaired, but the memory of it was still fresh in his mind. The last time he had stood here, the glass had been shattered, the shelves stripped bare. Now he was back. With a slow breath, he shut off the car and stepped out, locking the door behind him out of habit. The key turned smoothly in the store's entrance, the familiar weight of it grounding him as he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The soft chime of the doorbell rang out, a sound he had heard thousands of times before, but tonight it felt different. The store was still, peaceful. The polished wooden floors reflected the warm glow of the overhead lights, the glass display cases gleaming, though most of them remained empty. He knew that would change soon. Most of what had been stolen would be coming back. He walked further inside, trailing his fingers along the edge of the nearest case. The shop smelled the same. Clean wood, faint traces of metal polish, and the subtle cologne that lingered from past customers. It was all so familiar, yet it felt like he was seeing it from the outside, as if he had stepped back into a life he had been pulled from weeks ago. But things didn't go back to the way they were. Not after something like this. He reached the counter, exhaling as he leaned against it, letting his body rest for a moment. He was tired, but his mind was still too alert, still replaying every moment of the night. The fight, the chase, the look on Rico's face when he realized he had lost. It was over now. Rico was in custody. His crew had been taken apart. The corrupt cops who had protected him were now facing the justice they had tried to avoid. The damage done to the community would take time to heal, but tonight had been a step towards something better. His phone buzzed against the counter. He glanced at the screen. Detective Carter. With a small sigh, he picked it up and answered. "Didn't think I'd be hearing from you this soon. You didn't think I'd leave you out of the final update, did you?" Carter's voice was lighter than before, but there was still the weight of a long night behind it. Malcolm leaned against the counter. "Let me guess. Rico's still not talking." "No, but he doesn't have to." There was a note of satisfaction in her voice. "Between the evidence at the warehouse and the deals his men are making, we have more than enough to shut this down for good." "Rico's not getting out of this one." Malcolm nodded to himself. "And the stolen goods? That's the good part," Carter said. "Not just yours, but everything he took. All of it's being returned. Businesses that were hit, people who thought they'd never see their things again, they're getting it back." Malcolm let out a slow breath. It wasn't just about the money. It never had been. It was about the people who had been hurt by all of this. The businesses that had been struggling. The shop owners who had lost everything and been told to just accept it. Now, they weren't walking away empty-handed. Carter continued. "They're already making the calls. People are waking up to good news." She paused, then added, "Figured you'd want to know." Malcolm stared at the empty cases in front of him, knowing that soon they wouldn't be empty anymore. "Yeah," he said. "I did." Carter hesitated, then said, "You did good tonight, Malcolm. You really did." He smiled slightly. "You too." There was nothing else that needed to be said. "Get some rest," Carter said before hanging up. Malcolm set the phone down, staring at the reflection of himself in the glass display case. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel it. Not just the exhaustion, but the relief. The fight was over. Justice had been served. And tomorrow, people would be waking up to find that what had been taken from them was finally coming home. Malcolm glanced around his store one last time before heading toward the back. The night had been long, and the morning would come soon enough. But for now, at least, he could finally rest. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.